Hey everyone, we're joined today with Mike Hott, the author of Desperate Measures. He's going to tell us a little bit about the book itself, the units it represents, and a little bit about actually gaming with the book on the tabletop. So, Mike, you want to give us a brief overview? What is Desperate Measures?
Sure. Desperate Measures is a book about the last of the tank battles that happened on the Eastern Front in 1945, between January to about March, and just before Berlin.
Cool, very cool. Well, there's no better place to start. Why don't we jump right in and talk about the Soviets? And first, we should probably talk a little bit about how we kind of revisited the Soviets with Red Bear Revised and the Hidden Chicks and repointing and things. So why don't you take it away? Just brain dump.
This was a great opportunity to work on both all of our Soviet forces that were out there for late war. Because in effect, there's just two books out there for the late war Soviets. You have the Red Bear, and then you would have this book. So when this book came up, we thought, well, let's have a look at some of the issues and things like that tied up with the Soviets. It's the perfect timing to get both books done in one fell swoop. So the Red Bear changes that we've seen, there's a few articles and such on the website.
Right.
That was all tied up very closely with Desperate Measures. So both books kind of grew up right next to each other. So a lot of the issues that we tackled in the Red Bear are also tackled in Desperate Measures. So things like the Hidden Chicks, we decided that we needed to have a look at those points, the points discount for that.
Right.
And through some extensive testing and things, we were able to finally find the right spot where we were happy with those points.
Right.
And then applied that to T-34s and medium tanks of all descriptions for the Soviets.
Right.
So those lists, all the lists in both books were affected by that change. We had some other ones like Katyushas. We wanted to have a look at Katyushas. We could embrace the doctrine of shoot and scoot.
Right.
For them.
Makes sense, yeah.
So they're a bit like the German multi-heroes in that regard.
Right.
Also, and looking at their points as well, because it was an opportunity, again, to have a look at the points of both of those. So the medium and the heavy Katyushas both got a points break in both books. And the third thing we really wanted to have a look at was the cat killers for the assault guns.
Yeah, right, yeah.
So those were not really functioning the way we wanted them to. People were choosing other things instead of taking your assault guns.
It seems like they didn't really have a niche to fill. They were kind of at odds with other things that did what they needed to do better, just as a result of kind of where they sat in the lists.
Exactly. So, talking to the design team, we all sat down and kind of came up with the idea of giving them the Cat Killer special rule, which is effectively a semi-indirect fire for these tanks.
Right.
They were used as a kind of standoff weapon. Pick things off while the tanks and the infantry went in and actually did the work. So by adding that tiny little adjustment to the assault guns, we were able to then bring them into things like Tankovy lists, where, like you were saying before, they were competing with T-34s. Now they're supplementing them.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So one of the big things, obviously, is the new approach to Soviet lists for the late war, the heroes. Why don't you give us a little bit about kind of your approach towards representing these heroes, maybe a little bit of history about what they were, and I think one of the big questions people ask is, why not veterans?
Right. Yeah, there's the heroes. That was a fun aspect of the book to work on, because it was kind of the Desperate Measures features these later kind of organizations that go into these campaigns as fresh units, so very similar to what's already in Red Bear and things like that.
Right.
And effectively the same units at the end of their campaign. Because the Soviets didn't build the units.
Oh, they didn't do the Repel-Deppel kind of...
Right, yeah. They just ran their units down and then eventually pulled them out, and they could rebuild them, but it was a much more in-depth process.
More from the ground up as opposed to kind of supplementing.
Yeah. So the concept is you had to be with your tank, or be with your troops until the end. And so we were looking at that, and a lot of the units that would go into these battles. For example, a full Soviet tank corps would have 189 tanks. 3 months later, it would have about 30. So that's, you're losing 80% of your strength.
Right.
But the guys that are left are the ones that are, obviously have been able to survive it. Whether that's luck or skill or whatever. That's the result. So the concept behind Heroes was to take those guys, the fittest, the survival of the fittest, and turn them into a company. Just like everybody else, all the other nations, they've learned how to fight. They've learned how to deal with challenges, like clearing buildings and minefields and things like
Right.
that. They're just as capable as anyone else.
And that's largely represented by their skill checks. They
Yep.
skill check on a 3-up.
Yeah, so heroes can therefore do everything like veterans.
Right.
That involves a skill check, reloading Katyushas, tank escorts, all these guys that are doing actual work.
Right.
They get to act as veterans. However, there is always that issue with leadership, and a lot of times these guys who have been through hell are asked to do some of the craziest things that they can't say no, so they've got to go in and take care of it,
Right.
even though it's a crazy assignment. Like initiative was often punishable in terms of
Right.
company and battalion level
Right. Understood.
aspects. So you have an unfortunate leadership problems. There's still some teething problems that the Soviet Army still has to sort through there, but their actual infantry and soldiers are just as good as anyone else.
Right.
So that's reflected by the fact that you get to be veteran, but you're still running around being targeted as trained guys. But that's because you're asked to do some silly things. The net result in Flames War is you get cheaper than veteran troops.
Right. Kind of priced in between.
Yeah.
Cool.
So depending on your type of team, so some teams are,
Right.
you get a better discount than others.
So one thing you mentioned were the hero units sort of represent a unit that's been ground down. So people might make the assumption that as the war closes, all Soviets are going to be heroes, but that's not really the case, right? You're still having new ones raised. And
Yeah. There's a lot of units that are still coming in that are fresh, all the way up to Berlin. There are some units that have been fighting for a very long time, but haven't been in at the very front of the assaults and stuff. So they might only have suffered maybe 20 to 30% casualties as opposed to 80.
Right.
So those ones are still best represented by taking the older, or the more standard organizations.
Right.
And that way you've got two ways of fielding it. So it's up to you as a player to decide, at what point am I going to field these guys? I'm going to field these guys at the beginning or at the end of their particular campaign, because remember, their campaign might start when someone else ends. So there's going to be a lot of overlap and things.
Right. Cool. So any other stories or anything you can tell us about the heroes, maybe both historically and maybe playtesting as you kind of approached where they became?
Yeah, the hero model is quite a cool one. When the design team sat down, we figured out kind of what we wanted to do with these sorts of kind of really late Soviets. We wanted to build a model that we could use for any of the units that we wanted to represent. So we could do a hero assault gun company, which is in the book, a hero Tankovy, a hero Motostrelka, and eventually like a hero Strelkovy. And a really good example of a hero Strelkovy in the future will be the 756th Infantry Regiment, which is one of the 3 regiments that went into the Reichstag.
Right.
And the commanders from both divisional down to battalion really have some good memoirs and descriptions of the battles and things like that. And we kind of use that as our infantry model.
Right.
And apply it to the Motostrelka and stuff. So when we get to Berlin, we'll start being able to expand that a bit to look at them. For example, one of the battalions, all of the battalions in the 756 that went into the Reichstag were averaging at about 40 to 50 guys per battalion. And put it in Flames War terms, that's like 8 to 9 stands of infantry for a battalion.
Right.
And so that's very, very small.
Yeah.
And what the Soviets did to kind of counteract that was to infuse things like liberated POWs from POW camps and stuff like that, from German POW camps. They would send these guys back in and just immediately assign them straight to the divisions, the assault divisions. So these guys are coming in, they're quite, they've been prisoners for several years, they're not well fed, but they're really highly motivated. So they all that manpower is infused into these units that are heroes. Also, that contributes quite a bit to the fact that they may still be trained, because you've got guys that are just out for vengeance as opposed to trying to be professional.
Right. Yeah.
Every unit's going to be different, but it's you just got to find a model that works. And that was what playtesting was all about, was refining which areas we wanted to make sure that they retained their trained status, which ones were veteran, what they were good at, what they were not so good at, things like that.
Right. So you mentioned that a battalion would be down to 8 or 9 stands. How does that work for the tanks? You mentioned that entire, was it a division would be down to 20 or 30 tanks?
Yeah, corps would be down to 20 to 30 tanks out of 189. The 23rd Corps, I think, went in with about 170, I think, and came out about 6 weeks later with 34. So in the book, we reflected that kind of in a fluff sort of flavor-wise.
Right.
The companies are still, your combat elements in Flames of War are always going to be companies because that's what the rules say, so a company is a platoon.
It'd be confusing to not call it a company for the Soviets.
Right.
But in fact,
it's actually a battalion.
Right. So those 4 tanks that are remaining would be the 4 of the 31 strong battalion or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. So it's quite the whole company is called, the whole force is a brigade. It's a Hero Tankovy Brigade, as opposed to, if you flip earlier in the book, you'll see that it's battalion.
Battalion. Gotcha.
So that's just it's a nod to the size of these units.
That's interesting. Yeah, cool. All right, so anything interesting about the individual kind of lists in the book that you just want to highlight really quickly?
Yeah, there's some really interesting units that we were able to include at this point, because this is the Soviets are gearing up for a pretty big fight. They know that Berlin's going to be a big fight.
Right.
So they're bringing out all their big guns. One of the big things that they do deploy is the IS-2 OBR 1944.
Right.
It's exactly like the regular IS-2 with some internal modifications, but also a better improved front glacis.
Because it's now sloped instead of that
doesn't have
angle.
A little bit of a step. So it gets front armor 11. So it'll be quite sturdier against things like Panzer IVs and stuff like that.
Sure.
They had a small shot, but now they're proof against things like Panzer IVs and stuff.
Pak 40s, whereas before enough Pak 40 shots could take one down. But
exactly. So stop a couple of Hero tank escorts on the back of an IS-42 and IS-2 1942 and send them into buildings and things like that. And that's a big force multiplier for the Soviets, especially
especially hitting on 3 up. And,
So those are really cool. The other interesting things is Motostrelk and regular Strelkovy infantry. Any Soviet soldier, if they saw a Panzerfaust, it was picked up and taken with them.
Right.
There's an interesting story of a 45 mil gun crew that got overrun by a Panzer 470, and the Panzer 470 crew, after they had overrun the position, were kind of like looking around, poking around at the little nest. Yeah. And they found Panzerfausts and stuff like that stashed, teller mines and things. Right. So the Germans were the Soviets were collecting a lot of German gear. Yeah. And so they had a lot of Panzerfausts and stuff like that ready for that. So that's in this book.
That's nice.
In this book, you'll start seeing Panzerfausts being options for like their infantry companies or infantry platoons and things like that.
Right. And for Soviet players, that's awesome because now you have integral anti-tank weaponry, whereas all the other nations have had it for a while. Now the Soviet big blocks get them too, which makes them quite deadly.
Yeah. Well, they can defend themselves with something a little bit better than a PTRD anti-tank rifle.
Right.
Yeah.
Very cool. All right. What else is new? It's interesting.
There's some pretty good artillery. The Katyushas, like I was mentioning earlier, their improvement with the points coming down a little bit.
Right.
It's pretty cool.
Reduction in points. They can now get rid of their smoke trails on a 3-up for the hero units.
Yep. And then also reload the bigger ones quite quicker with the hero ones as well.
Oh, yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, they're a devastating little unit. A pair of them, for example, is actually a viable option because 2 of them put some loading crews on, and it's worth a 4-gun battery for like less than 100 points, I think.
Yeah, that's not bad at all.
So it's a pretty cool little option. So Katyushas are pretty. They'll be a good tool. The other thing for the hero units is regular tubed artillery. So 122s, 152s, even Z3 guns.
Right.
They're bombarding on a 3-up as opposed to a base 4.
Makes a big difference.
That's pretty huge, especially for the medium and heavy artillery.
Definitely.
If you've got all Panzerfaust infantry holed up in a building, best way to do that is just to move some artillery up and either direct fire them or bombard them.
Blaze away.
Yeah.
Oh, very cool.
So there's definitely some good options for support and things.
Yeah, and there's now a whole new paradigm with the Tankovy as well, without having to suffer hidden chicks. It kind of makes them a whole new force, really. Yeah.
It's an interesting. They play a lot like an early 1944 American or British force in a way. but they've got some pretty good. They got good tanks. The T-34-85 is a good tank.
Definitely.
You can mix in a few 76s as well to help deal with infantry or zip around the flank or something like that.
So how are you finding them? Have you played them much or faced them much?
Yeah. I've been able to play a few games with my hero Motorstroke. I find that they're a really good combination with the IS-2s, and you put some tankos on them with a couple platoons of infantry.
Yeah, I've seen you wrecking with those IS-2s.
Yeah, it's really cool. I think the biggest tip that I would offer people is to take always take the tank escorts.
Absolutely.
With your hero guys, because whether you're on an IS-2 or a T-34, sending those guys in to go clear out villages and towns and woods and things like that they'll get the job done.
I've been on the receiving end of some Motorstroke heavy artillery, and it was not pretty. Hitting on a 3-up makes all the difference.
Exactly.
Cool, very cool. So I think that ends part 1, talking about the Soviets. We'll be back for part 2, where we will talk about the Germans in desperate measures.
Cool.